So, uh, wonderful book. Listen, we're starting a new quarter today, and the title of the quarter is The Role of God's Law as it Relates to Our Faith in Jesus Christ. And our first unit is Love Completes, Law Falls Short. And it's from the Gospels of Luke and the Gospel according to John. Now, the lesson today concerns empty acts of piety versus actually performing justice and love of God. And it's a story being invited to the home of a Pharisee for dinner. And I had remembered the particular condemnation that Christ had given to the Pharisees, and I had just assumed that it was from the temple steps or in front of the temple where many of the Pharisees were. But actually, it's in a dinner setting. A Pharisee invites him to dinner after hearing him speak. That's when this happens. So the text is from Luke 11, verses 37 through 44. While he was speaking, a Pharisee invited him to dine with him. So he went in and took his place at the table. The Pharisee was amazed to see that he did not first wash before dinner. Then the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You fools, did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? So give as alms those things that are within, and then everything will be clean for you. But woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and herbs of all kinds, and neglect justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to practice, without neglecting the others. Woe to you Pharisees, for you love to have a seat of honor in the synagogues and be greeted with the respect in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves on which people unknowingly walk." Well, the first thing we know is Christ isn't going to be invited back for another dinner. But at any rate, the Pharisees, who were the Pharisees? And as compared to the other religious or political groups that were in existence then. And therefore, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. Now, first of all, the Pharisees. They were very influential in Jewish society. They were members of the middle class, mostly businessmen, merchants, and tradesmen. But somehow I had thought that the Pharisees were kind of exclusively grouped around the temple, but they were widespread within society. And they were religious authorities for most Jews. And they were also political. That's the important thing. Religion and the politics were mixed for them. They had great control over the general population. And they believed the way to God was strict obedience to the law. It's a religion based on the law. And after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, they were the only surviving group out of Judaism to survive. The Sadducees, on the other hand, appear far less frequently in the Gospels. And they were influential members of the Sanhedrin, which was, of course, the governing Jewish body. And many were from the priestly families. They were mostly concerned with matters related to the temple. And therefore, most of them were concentrated in Jerusalem. And they're mentioned more in the Gospels as Jesus approaches or gets closer to Jerusalem on this trip. Now, they're similar to the Pharisees in testing Jesus. They both wanted to do that. Now, the Zealots were the remaining group, and the Zealots were the political party of revolt against Roman occupation. And their influence led to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, the main source for the destruction of the temple is probably Josephus. Now, Josephus had been a priest, he had been a military commander, and one thing that caused him not to be a favorite of many of the Jews around him, he sided with the Romans. And he was down with the Roman occupiers at the bottom of the hill while the Jews were trying to defend the temple. And Josephus saw what was going to happen. And he tries to convince the zealots within, the police come down, surrender. And of course, if they had, they might have been able to save the temple. But they didn't do it. And of course, the temple was later destroyed, of course, 7 AD. But now, the interesting story of Josephus, he was brought before the Roman commander, and who was leading the troops, that were occupying and that would later destroy the temple. And Josephus said, you would make a good Roman emperor. Well, that was music to the general's ears. And after the temple was destroyed, he carried Josephus with him, and he took his army and started marching on Rome. And eventually he is made emperor. Well, of course, Josephus, he had a home for life. The emperor provided him with a house, a stipend, and he was able to do his 4 books. He wrote 4 books, and they're all collected. They've all come down to us. But Josephus' description of the destruction of the temple, and he tried to convince him not to, and to come down and surrender, try to save it, but they wouldn't do it. And but Josephus illustrates the very depth of their hatred against Rome, the Zealots. And now the Essenes were not mentioned in the Bible, and they existed in other writings outside the Bible. And one estimate was that the number were about 4,000 at the time of, during Jesus' life. And they believed their bodies were temples of God, and in rules of personal conduct, they wanted ritual above anything else, ritual, cleanliness. And of course, they believed in self-denial. Now, why did the Pharisee invite Jesus to dinner? What was his motivation? If they had it out for him, why did Christ get the invitation to come over to the Pharisee's house and dine with him? And one good thing when there's something you're curious about, sometimes if you go back in the verses prior to the Pharisee's house, you learn some things, and it kind of guides you with what may be the theme of some of the verses later on. Now, what came before the invitation to dinner and Christ speaking was Christ was at the temple, and the temple lawyer was trying to test him. And the temple lawyer yells out to him, what's the most important commandment? And Christ said, it's love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all their mind. And the second law is love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the second commandment in importance. And on these two, all of the rest of the commandments hang. And so the temple lawyer, not giving up, said, well, who's my neighbor? What happens then? It tells the story of the Good Samaritan and how somebody who's looked down on society, the Samaritans were looked down on by Jewish society, but he had been the only one to stop and help the man who had been robbed, whereas the priest walked by on the other side without stopping to help. The Good Samaritan, the Good Samaritan. So that comes right before Christ telling the parable of being tested at the temple, comes before his invitation to dinner. And so does that mean that the motivation, now the scriptures are silent as to what the Pharisees' motivation was in inviting Christ. It doesn't say why he's doing it. But we can work out that it might have been just another test. Was it curiosity about Jesus' faith? Or was it just to learn something, to try to trip Christ up at the first opportunity that he got? And that's why what came before seems to be some indication of what might have been the motivation, to get something to trip Christ up. In other words, to find something to test. John?
Christ knew what was going on. The Pharisee may have said, well, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So I'm going to give them.
That's the Godfather.
Christ never ran away from the fight. And he knew. He was a good Jew. He knew all about the ritual cleansing. He provoked it on purpose.
Yeah. Well, so it's all part of the testing process would be one way of looking at it. But the story that Christ tells is concerned with outward appearances, with what a person is really like on the inside. And cleanliness was all important to the Pharisees, and in the form of this ritual washing, not just washing your hands before dinner. It was more than that. There was a ritual connected to it. And the cleanliness was all important to the Pharisees. And was the Pharisee really interested in learning more about Jesus' teaching when he invited him to dinner? And the likelihood is that he would, but that's not in the particular scripture. Now, Jesus' response to the Pharisees' demand for ritual washing emphasizes the contrast between the outward and the inward person. And later, this theme is developed in the verses after this story. And it's the theme of hypocrisy. And so what does the lesson relate to us today? Now, none of us are Pharisees, or maybe Bradshaw, or Sadducees, or Zealots. Well, some of those were Zealots in here, let's face it. And Essenes, but we all are religious, and to a greater extent, to a greater or lesser extent, political as well. And we do in our daily lives mix the religion and politics. And have we ever been, and the book asks some questions, our lesson guide, have we ever been guilty of putting more emphasis on furnishings for our houses or offices as opposed to caring for, providing for others? And do we try to impress others? No, never. What was the old theme of Robert Hall? Dress for success. And do we have a wholehearted love of Jesus and his lessons of love and caring for others? And are we bound by rituals? Do we have closed minds in our attitudes to others? How many people make snap judgments when you first see a person? Click and place labels on them. I am guilty. I've represented people in the office that come in with tattoos that are swarming. It just crawls all over me. But what really hits me is the facial jewelry. Now, of course, most men have a ring in their nose, head by their eyes. No, I'm just kidding. But facial jewelry and what they do to their faces. And one girl came in with a gold bead on her tongue, in the middle of her tongue. And so, the main thing is trying to look beyond that, And I'm guilty of giving probably some bad advice. I said, look, we're going to court. Cover the tattoos, wear a long sleeve, and because you don't know what the judge's biases will be, you don't want to tilt it against you the first time he even looks at you. And even though they say they're not, and that they're not biased, there's something, what lies beneath. You know what I mean? we make snap judgments so often. And so at any rate, it's the outward versus the inward, what's inside. Whether, and the whole lesson really comes down to whether we really care about others and how do we exhibit. It's one thing talking about yes, the book, and that's interesting because and Ed's talking about yes. Think about the things that not only we've done, but other members of the class individually have done to help others. Ozzie Reynolds, I've heard him speak on his mission to Africa before, and it was amazing. It's one thing to say he went on a mission to Africa and he helped perform some surgeries, but to tell the stories of the people, the individual stories of the people that he helped, how there was some people that had walked for miles to be able to get the treatment. One guy could barely even see, blind, and after the surgery he could see. And what greater act of love when you're restoring a person's eyesight, his ability to see. It's really just it's wonderful, that story. Bob Harris's work, I think is mentioned in that book, yes. And his buildings all over the place. There's one story, and I call it when Bob Harris told it, I refer to it as the parable of the lizard skin coat. And Bob has been building some structure down in South America, and he's waiting in the airport, and a guy comes shuffling up to him, and he says, listen, I need money for an airline ticket to go home. Can you please help me? And so Harris buys into the story and says, well, yes. So he gives him the money for the ticket. And the guy says, I want to give you something. So he takes off this jacket. I called it lizard skin. And Bob had it in a sack. And he brought it to class when he tells us this. We didn't want to see it. We didn't want to smell it. The last thing we wanted to do was look at his jacket. That's why I called the lizard skin jacket. And on one hand, if you looked at it cynically, it would be that the guy was doing that for the airport cameras, that he was a hustler and he was getting money from people who were waiting who looked like they could pay it. And by handing him the coat, it looks like he had sold it, So if you'd taken a vote that morning when Harris told the story, we'd have voted overwhelmingly that he'd been taken. But this guy was a pro. He was getting the money out of people that he could get the money out of. But then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, no, it's the motive that Harris had in giving him the money. Whether he was a fraud or not, it was Harris's concern for the man that he wanted to help. So we don't know whether the guy was a fraud or whether he wasn't. We've taken a vote, we said he was a fraud. But the real point of the story was Harris's concern enough to care for the man and help him. And, oh God, I can't let Hap Roberts get out of here without complimenting his wonderful work, his contributions. And I'll never forget that banquet as long as I live. I was sitting beside Bob, and I could tell how deeply he was affected by the experience. And when people said what it meant in their lives, do you remember some of those, Dan Williams and some of the rest? That was something irreplaceable. None of us who were there will ever forget it. So that really is what the lesson's about. It really comes down to whether we genuinely care for others, both inward and outward, as Christ taught us. That's the point of the lesson. Money, honeys.